Hello, it's Richard Pearse from Finextra TV, and we've got a real thrill today. We're talking to Rhian-Mari Thomas, who's from the Green Finance Institute, where she is the CEO. Hello, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Richard. Delighted to be joining you.
Yeah, well, thanks. Really appreciate your time and your busy schedule. And I was casting my mind back, looking at your LinkedIn profile, as you know, to see that you're CEO there, but also your time as the global head of green finance at Barclays Corporate Investment. And that's probably where we first met, I imagine, some years ago.
It's going back a few years now, actually. Yes, but
Yeah.
yes.
But you've been doing this exciting role for quite some time. That's what we're talking about today. And actually, a good friend of ours, Anne-Marie Slot from Transition Value Partners, did a great podcast with you, which we recommend to people. But in that, you sort of spoke about the Green Finance Institute. And, please give us a quick reminder of that for anyone that isn't familiar with it. But also this key phrase I loved. You said, we're here to avoid financing ourselves into extinction. So tell us more about the GFI and that phrase.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to do that. And yes, shout out to Anne-Marie and her podcast. So the Green Finance Institute's been around for 6.5 years now. We operate in 9 different countries, and our business model is pretty simple. We're primarily former bankers or investment experts who look at how we bring together the policymakers, the financiers, and the industry experts to look at how in each sector we can accelerate the investment of both private and public capital to get the outcomes that we need. And those outcomes are both decarbonisation and nature positive, but increasingly they're about healthcare outcomes, they're about prosperity, they're about creating jobs, they're about driving growth. And it's very much focused on genuine finance fundamentals, making sure that these opportunities for investment are, they meet people's risk-adjusted returns, they are sustainable, and it's very much about meeting the market where it is, as unfortunately not where it should be, but very much real-world pragmatic solutions. And it's going really well. And hopefully is contributing in some way to avoiding us financing ourselves into extinction. And I'm happy to expand on that. It's a phrase I think I picked up a few years ago from the work I was doing with TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. And basically, it says it's fairly straightforward, but unfortunately a bit of a gloom-athon, isn't it? But if you look at the major scientific review that comes out every year from the Potsdam Institute, their Planetary Health Check. Their latest one came out this summer, and it said that, we've now crossed 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries that they've defined. And I think that, they've got a sentence in there that says something like, this means that several of Earth's life-supporting systems risk crossing critical thresholds with severe consequences for ecosystems and society. But, what does that really mean? It means that, if you're younger than 60, there's a really strong possibility of witnessing radical destabilization of life as we know it through, widespread crop failures and apocalyptic fires, epic flooding, hundreds of millions of refugees fleeing vast areas of the planet that's been made uninhabitable by extreme heat or permanent drought, leading to economic chaos. If you're under 30, you're pretty much guaranteed to live through that. And the sort of these increasingly severe crises and the resulting societal unrest that really will be fraying the norms of civilization as we know it. We genuinely are talking existential risk. And then you look at the, what the finance community is doing about that. I mean, because we know that, the science is unequivocal. We know that what's causing this issue is, the emission of greenhouse gases, primarily from the combustion of fossil fuels. And we're looking at, since the Paris Agreement was signed, according to Banking on Climate Chaos Coalition, fossil fuel finance from the 65, I think, largest banks in the world has amounted to something like $7.9 trillion. And I think in their latest analysis, they showed that 48 of those 65 banks increased their fossil fuel finance from 23 to 24 to reach $869 billion. And then you look at the other side of this and you're like, okay, well, let's look at some of the mitigating factors. And, forests absorb about a third of carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels every year. And there was a UNEP report out just this week showing that private finance institutions have provided $8.9 trillion in active financing to companies with the highest deforestation risk as of November last year. So, and I think, it also goes into the point about agricultural subsidies that are harmful to the environment, which amount to around 406 billion in 2023. So we've got this urgent requirement to redeploy capital away from activities that genuinely are contributing to a sort of an apocalyptic outcome. But I don't think that's what we're here to talk about today, Richard, primarily,
yeah, but I think
because you can go down a gloom hole quite quickly on some of this stuff.
Yeah, I know. I tend to avoid the gloom bit. I think everyone's got that really, but I think it's still worth reminding us every now and again. I mean, more gloomy in a way is that you could have said this a few years when we were talking, and we would have kind of been a bit optimistic. Here we were, TCFD, TNFD, all the various acronyms. And people suddenly measuring and managing the inputs that are causing a lot of this, the finance and what it's financing. But all of that is kind of, it seems, backsliding at the moment. What's your take on this climate fatigue, if you will, and what is that meaning? I mean, you said you're doing well with the Green Finance Institute, but you're fighting against some of this as well, aren't you, I suppose?
Well, there's no point sugarcoating it. We're not where we were a few years ago in terms of ambition, both on the political side as well as on the finance side. But that said, and I think I've said this publicly a few times, even at the height of sort of the big tent initiatives and the big ambitious goals, private conversations, especially with financiers, they were saying, I'm all in on the agenda that you're so passionate about, but I'm not going to sacrifice short-term yield for this. It's not what my customers want. It's not, it's not my fiduciary duty, etc. And what I think we've seen happen in the last few years is people being more emboldened to say that in a public forum, and focusing, as I think they always have done, on finance fundamentals, right? There's no one has an ideological opposition to invest in green, clean technology and infrastructure. But it's a thematic like any other thematic in their view. And so whilst we have seemingly lost that sort of ethical argument that there's a moral imperative to look at this theme differently because of the existential risk, financial institutions are still doing good business. They're still looking at investing in these opportunities. We've just got to meet their risk-adjusted returns hurdles in the same way other thematics have to do. And that's the focus of our work at the GFI. And so our work is in more demand than ever. As I said, we're now in 9 different countries at the invitation of governments in all those countries, because they see the value in triaging finance with policy and industry, as well as obviously getting the inputs from civil society, academia, and other experts, to actually figure out, well, what are the barriers to getting money into these different sectoral transitions? And what are the financial mechanisms that you need to make sure that, the cost of capital is competitive? And what are the sort of risk mitigating mechanisms and solutions that you need to bring about in order to get over some of those sort of, perceived risk that especially are associated with first of a kind or early of a kind technology, where, we're not yet familiar with those business models and those, we don't have enough performance data to be comfortable in the way we regularly invest and lend. So I remain pretty optimistic that, we're in an implementation phase now where we're very much focusing on transactions. We're very much focusing on deal doing. And that's where I think we've got a big role to play.
And so, I mean, I think if you go back to also some of your other comments, you're talking about the transition plans, you're talking about the phrase we all hear a lot more is about, business resilience. And so the role of water is a significant one that people are focusing on, particularly when it comes to sort of the nature-related ecosystem services. And in fact, the winner of last year's Sustainable Finance.Live hackathon is in Africa using geospatial data and satellite data, etc., to monitor water resilience for a large soft drinks company, but in the landscape level, not at the manufacturing level. So when you think about that, why is that good business for a bank to be able to sort of measure business resilience in that way? What's that doing? Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, it's great to hear about the African business and your hackathon solution. So that's very encouraging. I think to answer your question, let me start by just highlighting the risk before we talk about the opportunity, and opportunity to shout out some work from my old employer there at Barclays, who applied, I think it was in September, they published I thought what was a really groundbreaking piece of research where they'd applied the TNFD's LEAP approach, so locating, evaluating, assessing and preparing nature-related risk. And they'd looked at 30, I think, of their mining companies that are in their portfolio and 40 European power companies. And they'd gone down very much to the asset level to actually quantify the nature-related risks. So I think that, in terms of the power generation facilities, they looked at 9,000 actual assets and concluded that a third of them are at risk from water-related issues, so drought or flood. And in their mining portfolio, that was 75% of mining company assets. So the reason I think, we mentioned climate fatigue earlier, the reason that I think water analysis is something that's really capturing financiers' attention is this concept of business resilience and the idea that water, as well as things like soil health and pollution and other things, they're very local. And their impacts can be very immediate.
Yeah.
So, a flood can wipe out supply chains, operating assets, quarter on quarter, with direct impacts on P&L. And that's, obviously that is a byproduct, or it's a result of climate change in many aspects, but it's something that is far more tangible.
Yeah.
And so I think this is in conversations that I'm having with financiers, both risk professionals and those who are actually, making lending decisions. This is something that's very front of mind. But to your point about, well, people can't invest in risk, they need to invest in opportunity. And the World Economic Forum did a really interesting piece of work that estimated that the adoption of nature positive practices in the mining and metal sector could unlock something like 430 billion in cost savings and revenue uplift. So not just talking about broader societal benefits, but genuine cost savings and revenue uplift across the sector's value chain by 2030. Gotcha. So it's, how are we going to support financiers and for the financiers to support their clients in identifying what those opportunities look like and how we finance them, I think is a really interesting area
I think that's, people talk about lower cost of capital if you understand your risk and you can see an opportunity upside. But quite often, because of the novel nature of, using satellites and geospatial data to monitor risk in the watershed or something, that's not known that necessarily that well by the banks. And so they don't go, oh, you're doing that, so therefore lower cost of capital for the soft drinks companies. So how do you see the sort of, in fact, often they seem to charge more because it's a bit novel. So this is where you guys focus, right? You try and sort of help the novel and crowd in. Tell us more about that. How do they get access to lower cost of capital when they're doing these novel things?
Well, there's a few answers to that question. I mean, one of them is a very direct answer, which is, how do we use philanthropic capital, government balance sheet, money from public financial institutions, all of which are seeking lower than regular commercial market returns. How do we use that money as effectively and as creatively as possible to provide first loss guarantees or provide revenue support mechanisms? There's a whole wealth of literature and analysis on all of this stuff. Normally it's called blended finance or structured finance. So, these types of solutions are relatively vanilla and familiar to people that work in finance. They're less familiar to people that don't. And you know, so there's a gap to be bridged there, a real execution gap around how do we make these sort of solutions more familiar and mainstream them. But specifically, and that, you know, and that applies to all sorts of project finance, infrastructure finance, pretty much everything. But you specifically asked a question around nature and water. And one of the projects that we've been working on is a few projects in that space. One of them is a Revenues for Nature project. It's an initiative that we do with 2 of the UN agencies, where we've identified 8 nature markets around the world that work, and our definition of work is capital is getting mobilized towards nature positive outcomes. The majority of them are compliance markets, where there's some kind of policy imperative for organizations to invest and to offset their biodiversity or nature impacts. And then we've built a community of practice around it. We found people to actually try and replicate and scale those solutions, because sadly we've learned over the years that, you know, just publishing a case study or highlighting or amplifying good work doesn't automatically mean other people will pick it up. There are genuine barriers in the way for people to replicate some of these solutions, and we're working with them to make that happen. So that's a pretty exciting project. And the other one closer to home is we've been looking in East Anglia, working with various businesses across the region to identify where climate change, nature degradation leading to water shortages and flood, both from coastal and inland, as well as soil health decline in what is a major agricultural hub in England, where those businesses are being affected, and, you know, identifying where those pressures are going to be negatively impacting their bottom lines, and coordinating those businesses so that they can, you know, they span infrastructure, construction, agri-food, and working with them so that they can collectively pay farmers and land managers to deliver nature-based solutions literally upstream. So, you know, by investing in nature restoration across the region, you're reducing business and economic risks, improving insurability, which is increasingly a topic of discussion, and shoring up resilience in the region. So these kind of landscape type organizational initiatives, I think, are really the way forward. We've been working with Lens, which you know, they've demonstrated the ability to do this in 5 locations already across Europe, because, you know, these things don't happen by magic. Somebody needs to actually coordinate, somebody needs to actually bring those, you know, identify where the cash flows sit in those chains and pull it together. So so that's one of the projects that Helen Avery, who heads up our nature work, has been doing.
What do you know the name of that project, Rhian-Mari?
Oh, it's just it's a project that we're doing with Anglian Water in East Anglia. So, and we're looking to replicate it in other and launch it in other regions too.
I was talking to Simon Crichton from Triodos Bank the other day about the River Wire projects that they did.
There you go.
Swats, and I think that maybe that's the same sort of thing. But as you say, it's that big coordinator role, isn't it? That is key. But you know, the way you summarise it, I won't try because you did it so well. I think that's really what we're looking for, is that people to see, so it's bankable, it's big enough scale, it brings together enough people, but actually you've got those whole set of benefits you started with at the beginning, which is, you know, it's local, it's social, it's people can feel it, it's not some sort of abstract climate thing, which is really interesting. So what, just as we sort of go forward and as we head into Sustainable Finance.Live focused on infrastructure, and it's this combination of the green meets the grey, and you kind of, that project I'm sure has got a fair bit of grey with it as well. What patterns and practices, where could we go within the Green Finance Institute? There's a hackathon, people would go, maybe, do we go to the Green Finance Institute and we get a few of their case studies, and that's basically what we've got to replicate? Where would you post us as the in a direction to try and learn from what you've been doing, which is so helpful?
I think there's a really interesting opportunity to look at how we integrate some of these nature-based solutions into larger infrastructure projects. And I know that's something that's close to your heart as well. I was reading the work of Save Soil. They're a subsidiary of Conscious Planet recently, and they conducted an analysis that explains how degraded or compacted soils lead directly to increased surface runoff during heavy rain. So, this is all, none of this is porridge knitting, right? This is all science. This is all real stuff. But, across Europe, floods now account for something like 85% of recent weather-related financial damages. And I mean, it's amounting to losses of more than £15 billion. So that, if incorporating techniques such as cover cropping, so that's, planting legumes or grasses or tilling soils less, can increase absorption rates of soils and the health of soils, according to, I'm not a soil expert, but I'm a financier, but according to people who genuinely do understand this stuff. And literally making the case for why that upfront capital expenditure investment will yield better returns, because you're actually thinking about business resilience. You're going to be spending less on, building grey walls to keep out flooding. We need to be helping familiarize all sorts of different stakeholders about how you bring those two things together. And I think that would be a really interesting aspect for your hackathon when we're thinking about infrastructure and project finance.
Yeah, I think that's very much where we're going, and that's a perfect summary with which to end. So thank you, Rhian-Mari. Really great chatting to you again, and thanks for all the great work you're doing there. We'll point people up to the GFI. Helen spoke last year as well, so we really appreciate your support for SF Live, and look forward to talking again soon.
Thanks very much, Richard. Do take care.
Bye.